President, ladies and gentlemen, it's again a great honor to be able to address the World Public Forum on some of what I think are the ardent questions of mankind in those days. And I want to focus on three areas that preoccupy me at the very moment. The first is, we have analyzed a lot the bubble of the financial markets that led us to an almost worldwide economic crisis, where some of the parts of the world survived it better, others less. But so far, no major conclusions have been drawn that are going to fundamentally change the rules of the game. And I give you some examples. I think there is a general consensus that this bubble of the financial markets basically came into existence as a result of enormous imbalances and enormous inequalities that dominated the world of business and economics. Are those imbalances reduced nowadays? Or are we going to continue these imbalances? And we are now in Greece. And you know, the expression of solidarity within the European Union is that 1% of the European GDP is spent for European purposes. So all the cohesion funds, structural funds, regional funds, all the social policy of the European Union, the adjustment for agriculture is 1% of the European GDP. At the same time, we face that the bailing out of banks in Europe at the minimum costs between 10 and 20% of the entire GDP. So for bailing out people in not privileged areas of Europe, we are spending 1% of the GDP. In order to bail out banks, we are ready, without any major debate, to spend 10 to 20% of the GDP. Which means that the inequalities within Europe and the inequalities within the respective societies will not decrease, but will increase. And that with the way that the crisis is addressed at the moment, we are already laying the foundations for the next, even bigger crisis that will affect our economies. And what is true for Europe, to a certain extent, is also true for the world. Because there are undoubtedly countries who benefited from globalization. There have been millions and maybe hundreds of millions of people who were drawn out of absolute poverty, be it in China, be it in India, be it in Latin America. So this has been the success part of globalization. But at the same time, when the alleviation of the most terrible forms of poverty in some parts of the world took place, the inequalities were increasing. And I'm mentioning a very good example which I know very well, which is the example of Chile. A very successful country, a very robust middle class, where in the last 20 years it was possible to alleviate poverty. But at the same time, this country nowadays has the highest level of inequality of all of the OECD member states. Even higher levels of inequality than the United States of America. And I very much share the conviction of my friend Joseph Stiglitz, who says that the reduction of inequality will make the world wealthier. The reduction of inequality will make the world wealthier. So it's not a moral imperative, but it more and more seems to be an economic imperative to spread the resources among more and more people on the globe in order to make the economic development more sustainable. Because with the present levels of inequality, no market economy will ever be able to function. And I tell you one practical result of that. The European welfare state that has been very successfully developed after 1945, which led to a result that in Germany, Scandinavia, Austria, the Netherlands, so some of the more developed welfare states, levels of inequality dramatically decreased. And those are the countries with the lowest level of inequality in the entire OECD. But the traditional forms of taxation and transfers, they only helped and worked at a time when it was still possible to bridge the gap. Under the new conditions of a new inequality that is arising all around the world, tax and transfer policies alone will not be able to bridge the gap. And therefore we have to ask the question how and if we are ready to intervene into the primary distribution of income and wealth around the world if we are not able to bridge the increasing gap by tax and transfer policies. And this puts an entirely new item on the agenda, which hasn't been addressed for many, many decades, but which seems to me is an extraordinarily important element in order to create a more sustainable economic development. My second remark. There was the discussion about imperialism. I think that the high time of imperialism is over, because the benefits that are generated for the imperialists are lower than the costs of exercising imperialist policies. If you look to the development of the world, did the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan make the United States of America or the United Kingdom stronger or weaker? Did the wars in the two countries improve the standard of living in the United States or in the United Kingdom or not? At the same time when these wars were happening, public infrastructure was degraded in both of the two countries. And real wages, by the way, were declining. And therefore also the readiness, at least in democracies where this freely can be expressed, but not only there, the readiness to support belligerent adventures in other parts of the world is dramatically reduced. Because people, if they're in favor or against armed exercises like war, they do not see anymore the advantage of being the winner in a war, because the costs are so high that they go at the expense of the most fundamental and vital interests of the broad masses of the people. The expenses for war go at the expense of public education, health services, and public infrastructure. And people are not ready anymore to bear that costs, independent of the cause that might motivate a war. And I think it was one of the decisive elements, apart from the skills of Russian diplomacy, that an armed intervention did not take place in Syria. Because both in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America, there is an emerging consensus that one should not engage in that. Which, due to my understanding, is an achievement. But on the other hand, this doesn't solve the conflict. So with the resolution of the Security Council, we have a major step forward. But we are far away from a resolution of the conflict that is there. And in that context, I thought the thesis of our Chinese friend today was very interesting and important when he said that the stronger nations in the world, they have a higher responsibility. If I put that into conceptual terms, what does that mean? You know, the category of property can be interpreted as an absolute category. Then property is the absolute right of ownership. In the critical legal theory, already 100 years ago, property was interpreted as a bundle of rights and duties. So property gives you rights to be exercised, but is strictly connected with duties. And when you were referring to the higher responsibility of the bigger or larger nations, if we adopt for this concept the same concept than the critical theory of property, which means power is also a bundle of rights and duties, then it could be, for instance, an interesting exercise, and not only an intellectual one, to say permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations have to comply with an enhanced bundle also of duties for the situation of the world, and those that want and are members, permanent members of the Security Council, they have to fulfill the duties that they generally agree upon, not only for themselves, for the entire functioning of our globe. Therefore, I think that this has been a very refreshing idea that has been introduced by you, which I think we should further deepen. And my third and final remark, and I have to make it. I was already referring to the post-ideological era, understanding ideologies as a closed system that we once should achieve, and then the history is over. There is a certain totalitarianism of thinking in different ways. And the most dangerous one is a certain type of totalitarianism in the understanding of market economy, which means the belief in the invisible hands of the markets, which is the belief that economic policy is not a question of interests or is not a question of different priorities. No, there is only one objective truth in economic policies, which is expressed by the International Monetary Fund, by the Troika, or by the European Union. By the way, an economic policy that in the test of reality never worked. But nevertheless, the doctrine is so predominant that it is only a question of right and wrong. And I have to say that this type of totalitarian market thinking that does not allow any alternative is going to lead many countries and societies in a complete disarray. Because the truth, in my understanding, is what at least is based on empirical evidence, that under the rules of globalization, the vulgar old economic theories do not work anymore. And therefore, we need the courage to question this neoliberal doctrine and to develop alternative ideas for a new functioning of the economy based on markets, but based also on political decision-making. How and to what extent and in favor of whom are we going to interfere into markets? Because markets alone never will lead to the well-being of all, but only to the well-being of the few. Thank you very much.